Okay, so after I gave Lauren the title, I realized that there was something catchier out there. So I did change this on my title slide. Instead of Blessed are the Peacemakers, which is very familiar, I called it Martyrs, Marches, and Peace Armies, trying to catch a little bit of the variety of ways in which Christians have tried to create or maintain peace. And this is going to be a survey of history. We're going to just take a look at some of the historical moments and see the way Christians have tried to fulfill Jesus' command to be peacemakers, or rather his endorsement of it in the Sermon on the Mount. As I've said before, I am not an ethicist. I don't have all the moral solutions, but I can sure tell you some fun and interesting things about the history. And of course, then we learn from those examples. That's the plan, at least. So I wanted to start with the question, what is peace? When we talk about peace, we only talk about making peace or being peacemakers if something's already wrong, right? So fixing the thing that's wrong is part of what we have to do to make peace. Peace is not just it's not a void. It's not an absence of violence in the same way that you could say that dark is an absence of light. There are certain things that have to happen for peace to exist, especially in a fallen world where things are already wrong. I'm going to start with the premise that justice creates peace. And my best illustration of this is my kids, who luckily aren't on this video now. But when my kids are fighting with each other, I have a couple of younger kids. I have twins. They're exactly the same age. They cross hairs with each other a lot. And when they're fighting, I want peace and quiet, right? Well, mostly what I want is quiet. What they want is peace. And this time, that's why they're arguing in the first place. They come arguing to me. They each want to make their case and prove that they're in the right because they want justice. Now, if I want peace in my house, the only way I'm going to get it is if we first attend to the issue of justice. And this happens in the adult level and in the international level as well. We only get peace if we pay attention to justice. We can try to make oppressed people be quiet about the harm being done to them, but this isn't really peace. Right or wrong, something is wrong and we're trying to fix it. And this is where the harm comes in. And this is why we have to attend to justice before we can have peace. So then the question is, how do we do justice without violence? For the most part, Christians agree that we can't see harm being done and try to stop it by doing more harm and expect that the end result is going to be everybody's healing. So what do we do? Another facet that comes up because of this is how do we relate to the government, to the state? Because the state's job is to create justice, right? But the state's primary tool is violence, either policing and punishment if it's our own citizens, or war if we're talking about an outside entity. So Christians have to attend to justice. We have to find ways to do it that don't just create more harm in the world. And we need to know how we're going to relate to the fact that the state is there with its own methods. How are we going to be part or not be part of that? So these are the issues that face the peacemakers, that the theologians and thinkers and the believers that we're going to talk about today. That was our introduction. Let's start where we were last time. We're going to start in the early church. And as we know, the early church was almost entirely pacifist. There was a belief that we just shouldn't do harm and we shouldn't do violence. And I wanted to start by talking about three different reasonings behind pacifism. We have Tertullian, Marcion, and Origen, all early Christian thinkers who all have different reasonings behind their choice of pacifism. We're going to start with Tertullian. Tertullian is the church father in North Africa, and his form of pacifism is legalistic. It's an absolute pacifism. The Christian never does violence under any circumstances, not even if there is injustice being done. Tertullian is famous for saying the blood of the martyrs is seed. He's also famously says that when in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus stopped Peter, who was attacking the high priest's servant, and told him to put away his sword, he says, in that act, Jesus disarms all soldiers. All Christians are supposed to put away their swords. How can Tertullian justify this absolute pacifism? It's because of his eschatology. Jesus is coming soon, right? The early church believed it, if anything, more fervently than the Seventh-day Adventists do. Tertullian says, we can't attend to justice, we have to do right, and God will make everything just. In the end, when he comes, the second coming will bring an end to all this injustice. He'll pay back the oppressor, and everything will be made right. This is, of course, going to be a little too simplistic for a church which will exist for centuries, for millennia after this. We also have Marcion. Now, Marcion is famously known as Marcion the heretic, and he's kind of discredited because he is a Gnostic thinker. But he also has his own form of pacifism. Marcion's pacifism is rooted in his Gnosticism. He objects very strongly to the physical world and the Old Testament God Yahweh, who's so terribly violent. Violence, he says, belongs to that physical world. And because of that, it's evil in contrast with the spiritual, which is good. Love is spiritual. So Christians won't engage in violence because this is going to root us in the physical world. Instead, we focus in the spiritual realm of love. Not very many practical solutions for injustice in the world, but then his Gnosticism allows him to excuse that. The world is the physical realm, we can just leave it to itself. Then we have Origen. Origen is not well loved by Adventists because he has a habit of interpreting the Old Testament allegorically. There's one scriptural passage where he is very literal on, where it's a reference to people becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of God, and he castrated himself, which is a strange exception to his allegorical reading of scripture. But Origen is trying to defend Christians in the public sphere. The argument going around in Origen's time is that if Christians will not be good citizens and participate in the defense of the empire and fight in the army, then they shouldn't enjoy any of the benefits of the society either. Christians should withdraw completely from society. And in fact, we have pacifists, we have Anabaptists sometime later who are going to take exactly this approach. But Origen says, no, that's not necessary at all. Instead, he says Christians actually do better service to the empire. They're better citizens because instead of fighting in the army, we pray for the empire. And that, of course, is much more valuable. On top of that, he says, Christianity spreads, more and more people become believers and they stop fighting you. Therefore, the empire has fewer enemies fighting them. So Origen's defense is going to be a pragmatic one. This is actually in the empire's good that we don't fight. In addition to these varieties of pacifism, I wanted to look at the example of the martyrs, which we did talk about last time. Martyrdom is seen as a response to violence from the state. The martyrs are not exactly pacifists. They don't see what they're doing as being passive, but rather a refocusing. The martyrs are fighting the real enemy. instead of mistaking the people and the Roman society for their enemies, they instead are fighting the spiritual battles. For one thing, as Tertullian said, martyrdom is an excellent way to make more Christians. Martyrdom is an altar call. Public executions are. This is true in the early church. It's also true in later centuries. When Polycarp, one of the earliest Christian martyrs that we know of, is questioned, he uses humor against the official who's questioning him, and he starts to draw the crowd in. Michael Sattler, way down in the Anabaptist story, also, they have a public trial, and when they're questioning him, they decide they have to cut the trial short because he's winning over the audience. A martyrdom is an altar call. We also have these seemingly, and the story says that a dove came out of the wound. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to process the miracle stories from the early church. Should we lump this in the category with the book of Acts because it's near the same time period, or should we apply that historical skepticism to them that we will for just about anything that comes after? But needless to say, even if we reject the stories of the miraculous occurrences, there's also the martyrs' behavior themselves. Perpetua, a famous young woman who's martyred when the heifer gores her or tramples her, she finds that her hair is disheveled. You know, she's got to stand up and face some other animal, and she asks for something to tie her hair back because she doesn't want to look like a woman in mourning. She says because she is going to meet her bridegroom. There's stories where the beasts won't eat the Christians, stories where the Christians keep getting back up. One of the young men who's executed with Perpetua, a man by the name of Satyrus, had befriended a soldier named Pudens, and he has Pudens' ring. I'm not sure if he asked for it in this moment or he'd been given it as a sign of friendship earlier, but he takes the ring and dips it in his wound and gives it back to Pudens, the soldier, and urges the man to remember him. Before they're martyred, in fact, Satyrus addresses the crowd at their trial who's scoffing at them and urges them to remember their faces because they're going to be executed with a great number of people, and he wants them to remember the Christians because he expects they're going to die differently. And he wants them to see how different it is for them. He wants to make their martyrdom an altar call. In this way, martyrdom really is a victory over Satan. It's the most appropriate battle for the Christian because it's a spiritual battle. Perpetua, again, had a dream the day before her execution. In her dream, she's going to the arena, but not tied up to be a victim, but armed as a gladiator. In her dream, she fights an enemy and she wins a crown of laurels, and she woke up saying that she knew she'd be fighting Satan that day. Literally, she wasn't fighting flesh and blood, but spiritual powers. So in this early church time, of course, the church has no political power. They don't have the burden of government on their shoulders. And pacifism is the more natural choice. You'll notice as we go through that pacifism is never embraced by a church which is in power. It is the oppressed groups, it's the minor sects, it's the people, the unpopular ones who take it up, which is a good segue into the medieval history. Okay, so as per our last conversation on this, you know that in the medieval era, the church is in political power, and the paradigm that they've embraced is the just war, or sometimes the crusade. So officially, the church is not a pacifist entity, but there are some official means, some attempts at peacemaking during this era. This is centuries of time, so of course there are some. These are just a few of them. The first one I want to talk about, the one I think is most interesting, is the peace of God and the truce of God. these are meant as a way to limit war. These are two ideas that were popular in France and in Germany, and they were campaigns going on to promote these two vows, the peace of God and the truce of God. So a local prince or ruler would take a vow, either one or both of these, and this would be a limit on when they or on whom they could make war. The truce of God said that you wouldn't make war on Sundays or on other holy days or during holy seasons like Advent or Lent. And, you know, there's enough of those seasons and holy days in the calendar that if it was strictly applied, this could really reduce war. That was the truce of God. The peace of God was taking a vow to limit who you could attack. The term said no monks or nuns, no peasants, no merchants, foreign visitors or shepherds, no harming flocks, burning churches or olive trees. Why olive trees specifically when there were lots of other crop trees, I'm not sure, but that was an important one. Of course, some took the oath but didn't actually keep it. How do you enforce an oath of peace? In this case, since the just war theory is the prevailing one, the answer is war. In the time, bishops are political entities, they're landowners, and they have armies. So in Germany in the 11th century, they were actually peace militias who tried to enforce the peace of God on rulers who were breaking their vows. There's a story of one that got so out of hand that it ravaged the local countryside, and the count had to send his own army out to stop it. According to the story, there were 700 clergymen who were killed in the process. So this was not a great way to make peace, it turns out, not terribly effective. Another bad idea was crusading. You know, crusade is the paradigm wherein you say, well, war can actually serve the purpose of God, so yay, go for it wholeheartedly. How's that a peace effort? Well, there were lots of reasons that the church promoted the Crusades, lots of them, but one of them was it was an effort to reduce war in Europe. If we can siphon off that violence and aggression away from our own land to somewhere else, this will be better. The argument was it's better that you not go to war against Christians, your fellow Christians. Of course, in this case, Christian and European are synonymous, and this is actually a racial thing going on. It's okay if you go and kill those people over there, but not our people here. A little more reasonable strategy was arbitration. The church set itself up as a peacemaker between different nations and different princes in an attempt to prevent wars. There is a weakness with this one too. Arbitration is a great idea. On the political level, it's probably the best tool we have to prevent war. But the fault here is that the church was so involved in politics at this time, often it was one of the parties, or else the princes didn't really trust the Pope's help because, you know, the church really might be strategizing for its own political advantage. All right, so the official means are not the most pacifist and not the most effective, but we do have some voices in the wilderness promoting and trying to maintain peace. It's interesting to note that sects, small minority groups, unpopular, unsanctioned groups, those who experience opposition or oppression have two choices. They can either choose the crusade, God is on our side and we have to defend ourselves in order to defend the truth, or they choose pacifism. Sometimes you have both branches or both alternatives in the same movements. The question for sects is always, do we fight back or not? And the Hussites are going to split on this. The Waldenses are going to fight back. But a little bit before that, I realize I'm skipping over St. Francis of Assisi. He's a great voice for peace in the Middle Ages. He was the one back to the Bible sort of sect that was embraced and accepted by the church in his time. You see him here in this picture, all crowded around by birds. St. Francis was famous for his love of animals and for actually preaching to the birds or to the wild animals and calling them his brothers. There's a rather unusual story of a village that was being attacked by a wolf. There was a wolf that would come and eat their livestock and things, and the citizens were going to go try and hunt down this wolf and get rid of it. And that St. Francis supposedly heard of this and came to the village, and he went out to arbitrate and made peace between the villagers and the wolf so that it wouldn't ravage the livestock anymore. I'm not sure what to think about this story either, but it is true that the Franciscans were rather more effective than the church at large as arbitrators between local princes and magistrates. Within Italy or northern Italy, they would actually go between towns and do arbitration and prevent some fights. St. Francis himself traveled with the Fifth Crusade to the Holy Lands to meet with the Sultan. He was hoping to convert the Sultan so that we could have an end to the Crusades. We would have an end to war, no reason to fight them anymore. Well, he doesn't overtly criticize the crusade. Still, St. Francis and later Franciscans are hoping that through missionary efforts, we'll all be converted together and we can be brothers instead of going to war. All right, so on to the Hussites. You may have heard that when Huss's followers resisted the formal church, that the Pope actually sent crusades against them. And the militant Hussites, they armed up and defended themselves, and they actually survived 5 waves of the crusade, which were sent against them. But there were a branch of Hussites who were led by Peter Chalcicki. And he said they must not go to war. His reason that they couldn't fight was because war always brought the most devastation on the poor and the peasants. In these days, if you have a war and you've got the nobility, the knights and such, bring in their people and that they go off to battle, most likely what's going to happen to them is they'll get captured and held for ransom, but the peasants are slaughtered without any regard for it. At the same time, it's the peasants who suffer if there's a famine because nobody's around to plant the fields, we're all at war, or if we've destroyed a crop or many of the enemy's crops in the process of the battle. It's not the nobility that suffer, it's the poor. And Peter Chalcicki says we can't have that. It's just unacceptable to go to war. Surprisingly, this branch did survive also, just like the militant Hussites, because there were certain wealthy lords that would welcome them onto their estates and give them a safe place, because they were hardworking peasants and they would work the land while all the other able-bodied peasants were away at war. Much as we admire the Waldenses as a denomination, the Waldenses did not generally embrace pacifism. The argument was that if we don't fight and let them kill us off, then God's truth will be destroyed. So we're fighting for God, protecting his truth this way. Well, we're going to skip ahead to the Reformation. We said last time that as regards war, there were 3 branches of the Reformation. There was the magisterial reformers who embraced just war, people like Luther, Zwingli. Then we have the Calvinist branch who end up getting mixed up in wars of succession in Europe and the English Civil War, and they take the Crusade ideal and say the state's job is to actually protect the true faith. And then we have the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation was divided also. It wasn't a one leader sort of group. It was all kinds of groups put together. And some of them were theologically based peasant rebellions and uprisings, and there were violent branches. But on the whole, the majority of the radical reformers end up as pacifists. By the way, this picture here that you see of a man rescuing someone in the ice is from the famous story of Dirk Williams, who was an Anabaptist martyr, in fact. The story goes about how he was fleeing from someone who was trying to capture him and arrest him, and his pursuer fell through the ice and was drowning. Williams goes back to rescue the man and pulls him out of the ice. And in fact, he's not very well repaid for his kindness. The man arrests him anyway, and he was executed. He's literally giving up his own life for his enemy here. In the Radical Reformation, we have a certain theological backing for pacifism, though. The radicals generally said that Jesus has created a radical break with the Old Testament model. Usually just war and crusade are justified based on stories from the Old Testament. You have a theocracy and you've got God commanding war. The radicals reject it entirely, saying that Jesus wants to totally change the paradigm when he comes. The Christians don't use the sword either to defend themselves or in defense of others. We just don't use the sword at all. The only option then for the Christians are to compromise on your values in order to create a government and a state in a world full of violence, or else we withdraw from society and we kind of create our own space. And this is very often the choice that they took. There's also a literal interpretation that usually happens when Jesus tells people not to take oaths. So there's very often they're not willing to hold office in the government. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of branches from the Radical Reformation. There's the Anabaptists, which are the most famous. This is where Dirk Williams comes in. The Swiss Brethren have chosen pacifism, but it's an active pacifism, much like the Martyrs. The Swiss Brethren start out as Ulrich Zwingli's students in Zurich, and they break with him on the issue of infant baptism. And they have this kind of mock debate with Zwingli. The city council's already on Zwingli's side, but they have a debate on infant baptism, and Zwingli is declared the winner. And since this is a religious government, the Anabaptists are told, or the Swiss Brethren are told, that they have to either baptize their infants and quit preaching, and also quit interrupting church services where infants are being baptized, or they have to leave town. Those are their options. And they have this prayer meeting together and they're fretting over it. Sometime January 1525. And they decide that they're not going to do either one. They have a prayer meeting, and Conrad Grebel asks George Blaurock to baptize him. He says that his first baptism doesn't count. He wants to be rebaptized. So they're directly violating the ancient laws of the empire forbidding rebaptism. And they decide to stay in Zurich and keep preaching and essentially allow themselves to be martyrs for the cause. So it's an active pacifism. Anabaptists get the worst persecutions, religious persecutions, possibly in European history. The Catholics burn them, the Protestants drown them. Balthasar Huppmeyer, one of the thinkers for Anabaptists, says that an oppressed person has three legitimate choices, since we're not going to fight back. You can either resist nonviolently, the way the Swiss Brethren had. You can choose to suffer silently, or you can flee. During this time in history, a lot of them fled, looking everywhere for a safe place where they can simply live in peace. Michael Sattler is one of the martyrs for the Anabaptist. He was considered to be the ablest mind among them. He was respected by his enemies, in the different towns where Anabaptists lived. And he is the author of the Schleitheim Confession, which is the statement of faith for the Anabaptists. When he was arrested and put on trial, he also had his trial cut short because he was answering so ably that he was starting to win over the crowd. In fact, they cut his tongue before they took him to martyrdom, apparently for fear of what he might say when he was being burned at the stake. But he had prearranged a signal with his fellow believers. They knew he was going to be martyred, and he said that the signal was that when the fire burned through the ropes holding his hands, he would raise his arm overhead and put up 2 fingers. And this was supposed to be a sign to them that a martyr's death was bearable. And he did, in fact, do this. We had this Reformation play once where we acted this out, not burning at the stake, but we had the little signal. It kind of reminded me of that salute in Hunger Games, but the sign of resistance there. But again, martyrdom as an altar call, martyrdom as active resistance and as a spiritual battle. Of course, the Anabaptists we're most familiar with today are the followers of Menno Simons, the Mennonites, the Dutch Anabaptists, the group that moved over to the United States, and we have Mennonites and Amish to this day who remain pacifist. The second branch of the Radical Reformation is actually a descendant of those pacifist Hussites, the Moravians. These are called the Hutterites. By themselves, they're called the Brethren, and I believe they exist to this day. They also ended up in the United States. The story I wanted to tell about them is during this Anabaptist persecution, the Hutterites found that a certain Count Leonard of Liechtenstein was willing to let them stay on his estate. Just as we said before, the radical wing of Protestantism, these people were generally peasants, hardworking people, and you needed somebody to work the land when everyone was at war. So Count Leonard of Liechtenstein lets them stay on his land, but the Austrian government still wants them, and they're threatening to come in and invade. The Count actually refused to give them up. He said, "If you come onto my land, I'm going to meet you with cannonballs." The Hutterites, however, are not flattered. They didn't want any violence happening on their behalf, so they actually got up and left. They didn't want any war to be the cause of any war, so they go off wandering again because they want to find a place where they can have toleration without being protected. Still in Austria, there's another story of about 90 Hutterites who they had all gathered together from different parties and sects because they were trying to unify the Hutterites. And there's the Austrian government and comes in and arrests them all. They've got 90 prisoners, and they were held in the Falkenstein Castle and tortured because they wanted to get some to recant. But when none of them do, they finally decide that they're going to be condemned to work as galley slaves. So they chained them all together, 2 by 2, by the neck. 12 days later, these 90 men escaped. That chain around their necks actually proved to their advantage because they managed to let themselves down by the window using that chain and helping one another out. And only 3 were recaptured. The rest end up going home. Roland Bainton, the author I was recommending last time, points out a difference between the Anabaptists being murdered and the Brethren generally just being exiled, and then the Quakers only being imprisoned, and how that changed how they relate to the government. And we're going to go on to them now. All right, moving out of the Reformation era, we get a little further along in history, and we've got the one more historic peace church, and this is the Quakers. It's founded by George Fox. George Fox critiqued the churches in his time. He traveled around and he would actually interrupt services to tell people what was wrong with their formalism and their value for wealth and power. He made himself really noticeable, really unpopular, and hard to ignore. He believed in the inner light. He was really a radical egalitarian because he believed all believers should have equal authority in the church because they were all led by this inner light by which God talks to human beings and by which we learn to recognize God's voice when we hear it. I like his inner light idea. It reminds me of the idea of enmity, when God says, I'll put enmity between the serpent and the woman, the ability to recognize evil. But because we all have this inner light, then God can speak to all of us. Quaker meetings are famous for being silent because Fox says you should only speak if you're led by the Spirit, and then everyone will listen, no matter who you are. And also decisions are made by consensus. If you don't hit a consensus in your decision, you just have to wait until everybody finally does agree on something. Anyway, George Fox was really kind of a fly in the ointment in the English religious landscape. And so he ends up beaten and imprisoned many times. And he's criticized especially because he won't fight for Cromwell. He lives during the time of the English Civil War. You have two sides, both religious groups. There's the king with the magisterial Reformation who believed in the church structure and in bishops. And then there's the Calvinist Puritans who are led by Oliver Cromwell, who are Congregationalists. And Fox doesn't agree with Cromwell, but it's not the reason he says he won't fight. He says he won't fight because he believes in the one who makes all wars unnecessary. One of Fox's followers later quotes Jesus' words, where he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my followers would fight." This is the reason why Fox doesn't believe in getting involved in wars. All right, moving on to later Quakers. The most famous later Quaker is William Penn. He's imprisoned by the government in England. And finally, they give him some land in the Americas in order to pay off a debt. So this is where we get the state of Pennsylvania. Penn was granted the land by the government, but when he comes, he tries to make a payment and buy it legitimately from the native people living here. Of course, that's legitimate according to his cultural expectations and not theirs, but he's doing what he can. And he tries to create the best Christian society he can. Now, one of the remarkable things about Quaker government and Quaker relation to government is how that egalitarianism creates a government that's extremely respectful of other people's consciences. The Quakers say, or maybe I don't remember if this was Penn directly or during his time, that there's a difference between when the burglar comes into your house and you try to fight him off versus the enemy soldier. Fighting an enemy, the burglar is doing something evil, but the enemy soldier may be following their own conscience. Therefore, I do not want to go and kill him. They have an interesting roundabout about conscience too, between the conscientious objector to war and the conscientious magistrate. The Christian may believe he can't fight and has to be true to his conscience, but what if the magistrate honestly believes that he's got to enforce military service? Then the magistrate can honorably jail that conscientious objector. The idea the Quakers had was that we respect everyone's consciences and you manage things in such a way that when this conflict is over, you can still go on and live together. In fact, we have to preserve the enemy. You can't destroy the enemy because they may be your ally in the future, and this is the goal. One of the remarkable things about Quakerism is that they are one group who is consistently anti-slavery. In America, a great number of Protestant churches end up splitting into two groups before or during the Civil War because of slavery, because there's a difference of convictions in whether or not people can be members and hold slaves. Some of them reunite afterward, others don't. But the Quakers are consistently anti-slavery throughout. I wanted to give a story in here about Thomas Lurding, who is an English Quaker and a sailor, just to illustrate the complexity of trying to be pacifist in a violent world. It's a thing that Adventists know well as we try to relate to military service in the US. Lurding is a sailor, and he's converted to the Quakers, or the Friends Church, as they call themselves. Now, there's him and a group of other Quakers or Friends on board the ship. And prior to this, they had participated in skirmishes and battles at sea, but now Lurding believes he shouldn't fight. So when there's another ship approaching and they think it's Spanish and they're going to attack them, Lurding and the other Quakers tell the captain that they won't fight. The captain is so angry, he draws his sword and he threatens to run them through. And Lurding's reaction is to begin walking slowly toward the bare sword, as if he's going to impale himself on it. When he was about 3 steps away, the captain quailed and backed down. And as it turned out, the ship approaching them was friendly. But this isn't the end of Lurding's troubles. Later, he's impressed into the British Navy. For a long time, he refused to eat because he didn't want to eat the king's food and become, therefore, the king's man. He says if he eats the Navy food, then he's going to have an obligation to work for them. He was offered jobs that were non-combatant roles, and he keeps refusing them. He refused to haul the ropes, to hand out the beer, or even to help the physician. Finally, he agrees to load grain into the ships. Then people point out, well, this is still assisting the war efforts. And he says, well, he'll do this because he was commanded to love his enemy. Sometime later, Lurding is in a merchant ship and they're taken by pirates, and the pirates manage to disarm them all and take the ship. But somehow Lurding and his friends, they befriend the pirates, and they manage to turn the tables and actually imprison all the pirates in the brig down below. Now there's the question of what to do with them. They don't want to take them back to the European authorities. These are Barbary Coast pirates, because they're sure that they'll be hung and they don't want them to be killed. But they also don't want to take them somewhere where Lurding and his friends will be endangered by being the minority. So finally, they decide to let them out on the Barbary Coast. But how? Now, they have a rowboat, and it'll hold 14 of them, 14 people at once. And I think that there was, 9 pirates or something. Anyway, they're going to be outnumbered on the boat. And they're afraid if they take 2 trips to cross, to put these people on shore, by the time they get back with the second boat, the first people dropped off will be back at the shore with friends. So, and then they don't want to carry guns either. So they decide finally that they're just going to put everybody on the lifeboat at once and take 1 trip and be outnumbered and take the risk. While they're crossing, one sailor says, oh, there are Turks on the shore, and the sailors are worried, and the pirates begin to rise up threateningly. Lurding is afraid, and he doesn't know what to do because it seems like they're about to get murdered. So he picks up a boat hook and hits the pirate captain with it. And then everyone sits down and acts like friends again. Not exactly nonviolent, but he manages to get out of there without anybody being killed. All right, 2 more areas I want to talk about. I know I'm going a little over time. I'm gonna be quick about it. In the 1800s, we have peace movements going on. 1700s, the Enlightenment had come up with all these grand ideas for how we could make peace. We could have a parliament of nations and an international police force so that the decisions this group makes will be, for sure, solid. Most of the conflict going on is about regarding colonization, who gets control of other countries in the world. One voice says, well, let's just divide up the world among the European powers, of course, for trade purposes, and then we'll have an agreement and nobody will be battling anybody else for their colonies. Another, I think it's Kant, says we should just get rid of this harmful colonization in the first place, and we'll put the international interests above our national ones. Of course, that obviously didn't go anywhere. We get to the 1800s, and we have people who really want to put these ideas into practice. And we have a social movement and a political movement here. We have, on the social side, we have peace societies that are created, and many churches take up official stances that they oppose war for any reason. Just, they won't support any national wars. Of course, when we actually get wars coming on, in World War I breaks this up, then everybody ends up jumping to the defense of their own national group. It's very similar on the political lines. We have political movements that are meant to create peace. And we've got arbitration for one thing. There's an arbitration movement, and we get like a 5 or 8 times increase in attempts to arbitrate conflicts rather than going to war. We also have complex peace treaties that come up where nations they make vows not to go to war with one another. William Jennings Bryan is the guy in the picture here. He was the US Secretary of State. He actually created a peace treaty among a large number of nations. And in order to celebrate this treaty, the US War Department took swords that had been used in combat, and they melted them down for the metal and formed them into paperweights in the shape of plowshares. And they gave them to all the delegates to this event where they signed this treaty. And of course, when World War I came along, the treaties simply complicated the loyalties. When people were jumping into war, it drew everybody and their allies in instead of keeping everybody out. Once again, it's usually not the people in power who do the best job at creating a real lasting peace. I wanted to talk about one more historical example of peace movements. This is a justice movement, of course, the civil rights movement. But as we said before, justice is a necessary component of creating peace. We don't have peace when oppressed people are simply effectively kept quiet. And on top of that, it's not really a good long-term strategy. It's not possible to keep oppressed people quiet indefinitely. So even if we didn't care about justice, if we care about peace, we're going to have to address justice. King's branch of the civil rights movement used nonviolent protest and nonviolent resistance in order to pursue justice. I'm going to focus in simply on one article of many that he wrote during his lifetime about nonviolence. This was one called Nonviolence and Racial Justice, and it was written in 1957. In it, he talks about his philosophy of nonviolence. First of all, he decries an unjust peace, that is, a quiet, which is not really peace. Then he addresses whether or not one should use violence to meet oppression. And he doesn't attack the violence based on moral reasons. This doesn't mean that he doesn't have moral objections to it, but instead of questioning the morality of violence, he questions its efficacy. He says the reason to object violence is simply that it won't work. It's not going to get the hoped for result. Violence is like a boomerang, it comes back. Like a pendulum, it just keeps swinging, except the arc tends to get greater on each pass. If we choose violence to meet violence and to meet injustice, we're going to become trapped in a loop of revenge. We don't even have to debate whether violence is right or wrong as a means of justice, because it's simply not possible as a means of justice. Instead, he talks about his principles of nonviolent resistance. First of all, he says nonviolence is just as forceful, it's just as courageous as meeting violence with violence. It takes just as much physical courage, you could say. But nonviolence is different, because instead of trying to defeat the enemy, destroy or shame them, nonviolence seeks to preserve the enemy. Why? Because we need to make a society together. In fact, he says nonviolence, active resistance to oppression, is addressing the spiritual battle, because the enemy, the oppressor, also is trapped in his own or her own sin, and they also are being harmed. By breaking down this evil system, you are going to actually free the enemy. So the real battle is a spiritual one. By the way, does any of this sound familiar? Like from the Martyrs. And real nonviolence avoids the internal violence of the spirit. One of the things I love about Luther's philosophy of nonviolence is that he's not simply searching for justice in this justice movement. Justice would punish the enemy and say an eye for an eye. King wants out of the cycle of violence. What he wants is greater than justice. It's beyond justice. Instead, it's righteousness. So, of course, we know that social justice is an ongoing struggle, just as every peace effort is. We don't have peace today. We don't feel like we're closer to peace today necessarily, but we have learned a lot from people who have pursued it in the past. We're going to have this continued tension for peacemaking. We need to be able to pursue justice and righteousness in the world. We can't simply be inactive, but in a way that doesn't simply add more harm into the world. In this, I think we're going to end up where we started, with Tertullian. Tertullian's legalistic view of pacifism, it's not adequate, because it doesn't account for the vast amount of time in which Christians live in society and want to do good in it. We can't necessarily embrace his legalism. We may, or we could say his idealism, but we're going to need to embrace his hope. And that is the only perfect solution is going to be the justice and the peace that God brings us. It's the hope of the second advent. Isaiah 11 talks about this perfect world in the future, where the wolf will lie down in the land with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. And the reason this is all possible is because they will neither harm nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And this one from Isaiah 32, 16 and 17. The Lord's justice will dwell in the desert. His righteousness live in the fertile field. The fruit of that righteousness will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever.